The Curse of Lucille, an original railway ghost story written and read by Chris Eden Green, inspired by Sleep No More by LTC Rolt. Synopsis. As an enthusiast born into a railway family, Andy was in his early 20s when he was offered the chance of a lifetime, a full-time job renovating and running a beautiful Victorian steam locomotive. But as he learns more about the history of this unique machine, a series of unnerving stories and events puts him on edge. How long will it take for youthful enthusiasm to turn into weary and fateful regret? It's funny how life can throw its curveballs, isn't it? Some may gain a fortuitous employment or lifestyle opportunity, acquired through chance leading to a lifetime of bliss. But others may get a stroke of bad luck, resulting in their ultimate downfall. Two opposing curveballs led me to where I am now, His Majesty's Prison, Maidenmore. 45 years I've been inside. It's rough in here, proper rough. Ronnie Barker had it easy, I'm telling you. At least the people he dealt with can make you laugh. We all know what people say inside. Didn't do it, everyone in here's innocent, and so on. But sometimes the worst things really can happen to the most unsuspecting people. In my case, I took the blame for something that had to be seen to be believed. My situation led to shame on my entire family, whose tales can be traced back over 1.5 centuries. But I'm glad they didn't experience the shocking woes that I did. Woes that were caused by a lady named Lucille. The lady I speak of, who I first learned about through my grandfather passing down stories of her existence, wasn't a loose one or an animal of any kind, but a steam locomotive. Not famous like Flying Scotsman or City of Truro, but a little-known colliery well tank. She was a weird case in that she'd never carried a works plate, so none within living memory could recall when or exactly where she came from. But her design was similar to those half a dozen built at Haydocks through the 1870s, like that one that ended up at the Worth Valley back in the 60s. But unlike her sisters, who went to work for the Haydock enterprise, and occasionally worked the London North Western, she was offloaded immediately to the Granwell Colliery Mining Company, of which her designer had a close link with. The Granwell name goes back half a millennium, to when local businessmen tapped into the high mainsail in County Durham back in the 14th century. It were a sluggish trade in them days, taking longer to get coal a few miles to Tyneside than it took to ship it down from there to London. Early wagonways in the area worked by horses would barely get above walking pace, but the coming of steam power kicked life up from first gear and into overdrive. Before, you were lucky to ship a few hundred tons of coal in a year, but after, you could move more than that in a single journey if your engine was strong enough. The Industrial Revolution led to Granwell's booming in the trade, and demand quickly grew to obtain a pair of second-hand locomotive engines left over from the Stockton and Darlington Company. But when one went from life expired to being a source of spares, the colliery's then owner, Arthur Granwell, knew it was only a matter of time before life caught up once again, so put out tender for a new machine. That's when our Lucille entered the story. She was named through choice of Arthur's wife, being of French descent and thinking their new acquisition represented a period of illumination and brilliance. Besides major refits and supplement from a pair of 16-inch Unslets, Lucille served the pits like a faithful Labrador serves its master. Until a major twist of fate turned her against him. My involvement in this saga began about the same time as interest in Lucille began to generate again. My family background weren't in collieries, but railways. My great-uncle's accounts of manning a mysterious box near a tunnel up on the fells are well known. His offspring, like the dynasty before them, worked numerous railways from the North Western and Grand Trunk right through to the grouping and into BR days. But I didn't follow in their steps on the footplate or signalling, for by the time I was born in 1954, BR already started their plans to modernise. My earliest memories of steam were being taken down by my father to Lostock Hall to see the numerous 8Fs and Black 5s being prepared for the long climb over Shap to Carlisle. I was only just able to walk then, but little did I know that by my teenage years, the only steam engines I'd see were being run by preservation societies. I studied civil engineering in my youth and gained employment at Balfour Beatty, but I kept an active interest in steam, joining the Worth Valley as soon as I was old enough. It was there that I eventually made friends with a group of students from the University of Stafford, who felt that Keighley was too much of a trek for them. They thought that one of the short colliery lines closer to home would be more their cup of tea. So it came to be when the National Coal Board announced closure of the one at Yarley Pit. We took our chance, formed our own preservation society, and although it took a year of negotiations, we ran our first trains on our own metals in the summer of '76. Yarley Pit itself is a modest operation, not like your Bluebell or Worth Valley lines, but like Lucille herself, your industrial rail fan may find it a delight. Situated in deepest Staffordshire, it's only a few miles long and boasts a bank of 1 in 25 coming up from our base at the pit, so those of you who like a bit of clag won't be disappointed. But like the Bluebell, its base is a bit far out of the way, miles from the nearest town and deep at the bottom of a long drop down from the main road to Stoke-on-Trent, hidden in dense, tall woodland. Anyone who managed to get rolling stock down there by road must have been a miracle worker, for the turn off the main road to Stoke is a steep stone track through the trees. It's rather sheltered, not the sort of place you'd like to hang around for long after dark, but in the high months, when the sun is out, light trickles through the branches, creating idyllic beams shining upon us as if our own little railway was blessed with its own spotlights. Our first few years were easy going, with no major dramas. We were fortunate to inherit the residential pair of working austerities and a Bagnall, which gave us plenty of emergency cover and the luxury of enthusiast specials. Our facilities were above our competitors too, for the colliery's founder had installed a small machine shop to maintain its locomotives, which the NCB refurbished with new lathes, one of them being big enough for wheel turning, a milling machine, a linear shaper, 2 overhead 16-ton traversing cranes, and a small furnace for heating up rivets. So we could undertake all major repairs barring new castings. The only antiquated thing about it was the coal-burning stove we had in the corner for heating, instead of a diesel generator. We were a small force that worked hard for our efforts, and those on the bureaucratic side had to regularly fill in as part of the operating crew. But all in all, we were content at the Yarley Pit Railway. Working our way through challenges thrown at us by outside circumstances, we happily went from strength to strength. Then in 1979, 3 days after the election of that Mrs. Thatcher, we received an interesting letter that took us all aback.
To whom it may concern, I write to you regarding the conservation of the historic locomotive ordered by my great-grandfather for use in our family business. In the event of receivership, I would like to ensure the survival and restoration of this engine, but lack the facilities to undertake the work. I therefore ask if, providing necessary backing from yours truly, the Yarley Pit Preservation Society would be interested in viewing the engine, to discuss a base for overhaul and subsequent operation. Yours faithfully, Mr. Jeremy S. Granwell.
We recognised the name both through the Granwell peerage and as an eccentric local millionaire whose hobbies included collecting and running a fleet of traction engines. He'd laid a narrow-gauge railway around the grounds of his ancestral residence. He even held a free village fete every year, which all the locals loved to attend. Yet despite his magnificent inheritance, he chose to stay on at his family's colliery when the NCB took over. The camaraderie with his workforce was just too strong to break. He eventually worked his way up to manager, but by the early 70s, business was already winding down. He fought to keep the mine open when the likes near Bowes, Tanfield and Yarley Pit itself had stopped, but talks of redundancies weighed hard on him. I had a sneaky suspicion the old man knew what was coming as soon as Maggie rose to power. Indeed, 5 years later, amidst the miners' strikes, Granwell's were amongst the pits that would close for good. But even before then, Its manager couldn't save it. We took up the old man's invitation, and 3 weeks later, myself, along with fellow trustee Bill Tinwell, drove down to Granwell's to assess the work involved. Driving into the yard took us past the big winding engine, towering commandingly over all beneath it like a guard post in a prison camp. I couldn't explain why at the time, but passing that tower gave me a weird vibe of the place. When we got out the car, Mr Granwell was quick to greet us, standing next to the long bonnet of his quite flashy roadster. A panther, if I'm not mistaken. He seemed in good health, with only a silver streak in his hairline suggesting he was advancing in years. We found Lucille in her shed, boarded up at the end of the yard. As you can imagine, she looked a bit worse for wear, with everything covered in a deep layer of surface rust. Her bottom end didn't look too bad, but what remained of her valve gear had seized up. Her cab and one of her tanks had gained some unwanted holes. But my biggest concern was the boiler. She'd obviously need a retube, though a casual glance implied both barrel and front tube plate looked sound. Less said of the firebox, for I could see a large gouge in the backhead where one of the washout plugs should have been, as if it had been ruptured out by a force from within. This would mean welding it up and cutting a new thread, assuming the metal around it wasn't completely wasted. I peered through the firehole door and found the inner firebox had no suggestion of leaks. It was then that I felt a sudden cold draft circling round my head as it drew through the door. I've poked my head through many such doors when engines are cold, but few times have I felt a breeze being drawn this strong without a blower to assist. As I climbed down from the cab, Bill and I went to the office and browsed through the colliery's archives, which were surprisingly intact. We found that her last major refit was in 1923, where she'd been fitted with her third boiler since construction. But collieries can work a boiler hard, and it's not long before their life expired. The garret that worked the Baddesley colliery can attest to that. But there was nothing of any detail beyond 1932, except for 2 notes. The first one suggested a gap between records of 9 years. 1st of May 1941, colliery output increased in light of merchant shipping crisis. Engine to be returned to operational use at the request of colliery manager. There followed a second, more intriguing note, which left me befuddled. 5th of May 1941, engine to be boarded up. Such a sudden U-turn raised so many questions. When exactly was the engine withdrawn prior to this? And why this sudden change of mind? The archivist, who'd only been on the job a few years, knew nothing about it, but a bypassing mine worker seemed more flippant on the subject. Good luck with that one. The last person who touched it was found dead, apparently. I must admit, the engineer within me believed this man was having me on. It was then that an excited Mr Granwell approached me near the shed door.
So what do you reckon then?
I gave him my full assessment, explaining that we'll need to refit the motion, build a new water tank and cab, but I wasn't entirely sure about the boiler until we took it apart. I had barely finished giving my report when the millionaire's enthusiasm cut me off.
Reckon you can do it this year?
I thought he was joking at first, but the look on his face suggested he was taking no prisoners. I can't commit to it full time if I'm working in the week, I advised. His reply was somewhat impatient.
Would you take a full-time wage for it?
I didn't know how to answer for a moment. Was he offering me my dream job of overhauling steam engines full-time? Not many people get to do that. And why was he so keen to see her run again so soon? Was he not a well man? Was he testing me? Possibly seeking someone to look after his fleet of traction engines? In the heat of the moment, he pressed on.
I'll double what you earn for it, so long as she steams by New Year's.
Not that my existing wage was negligible, but I had recently married and my wife was struggling for work, so an income worth 2 of us would be a comfortable buffer. Intrigued, slightly shocked, but ultimately flattered, we shook on it. I would hand in my notice at Balfour's in the morning and start immediately under my new position. I wish now that I had said no then, because that dream job I'd imagined eventually turned into a living nightmare. The first step was to get her down to our base at Yarley Pit. There was no direct BR connection with us, so we had to take her by road. We brought a lower loader down to Granwell's the following day and were able to use the onboard winch to get her out of the shed. But staying in one place for so long meant dismantling the handbrake and connecting rods to enable movement, followed by the engine groaning and squealing at the motion as she was edged forward onto the lorry. As someone who felt a steam locomotive was the nearest a machine could be to a living creature, I wondered if Lucille was expressing discomfort. Nevertheless, we got the engine out of Granwell's, and with the skill and patience of our driver, we managed to unload her inside our works that evening, despite the motion complaints. Work began the next day with a gang of volunteers. I led half of them with stripping down and cleaning up the old motion. Bill led the half removing the boiler cladding. Every part was labelled with red lead paint so as to not mix anything up. The months passed. With materials bought by Mr Granwell, I fabricated a new water tank, made good progress on a new cab, and managed to overhaul all the motion. This included the unenviable task of dropping the wheel sets for turning the tyres on the big lathe, leaving the locomotive on axle stands. Refitting them and reassembling the valve gear alone took up 3 weeks of my time, with the added bonus of fitting new rings in the pistons. Gangs of volunteers helped out at weekends, and late into summer, the bottom-end overhaul of Lucille made excellent progress. Aside from initial painting of the cladding and smoke box, nobody touched the boiler itself until the trees began discarding their leaves. Speed was helped by the fact that all work could be achieved while the boiler was sat in the frames. To be honest, I didn't think that much of it at first. I began work on it proper at the start of October, beginning with cutting out the old boiler tubes. All seemed ordinary, like my early days volunteering on the Worth Valley. Then, that first Sunday, I arrived at the shed for a driving turn on one of the austerities, when my fireman, a Mr John Surtees who lived just off the main road, said something peculiar to me. "Been burning the midnight oil, Andy?" he joked. I asked what he meant, telling him I'd been going home every night at 6 o'clock. "Then how comes there's been light and smoke here these last few nights?" John replied. I couldn't understand what he meant. It was the off-peak season, so I was the only person on site during the week by this point, and I'd been coming in every morning with no further work done in my absence other than weekends. But John went on saying that during his regular evening walks, he'd spotted a gentle trickle of smoke coming out of the vents in the roof, and a faint flicker of light through the windows, as though someone was still working inside. To be fair, the daylight was getting shorter, so the sun had started going down long before I clocked off midweek. But there was something odd about smoke coming from anywhere other than the chimney out the corner stove. But John didn't finish there. "I'm surprised you took that job on to begin with. Haven't you heard the stories about her?" "Which ones?" I asked. "About her body count," he replied, his tone shifting somewhat. "You mean she killed the last person to touch her?" I remarked. "Load of nonsense." I was in no mood for being talked down. But John went all serious, putting his hand on my shoulder as though to stop me in my tracks. "It's no joke," he insisted, "and it's not the only one." It was here that he uncovered the full story of how Lucille had survived all this time. Granwell's got lucky in the crash of 29, for they didn't sink their fortunes into Wall Street connections like others did. In fact, when all is considered, Granwell's track record was seen as spotless in them days. Lucille's regular driver at that point was a man by the name of Desmond Harold. Nothing unusual about the name or occupation, but he was so short and wiry in stature that he had the uncanny talent of crawling into any tight space imaginable. He was of great use when Lucille needed a boiler washout or her plugs or fire bars changed, for he could get underneath her ashpan at rail height without needing to park her over a pit. One could say these days that he was an urban explorer's best friend, for he also had the energy of a youthful gazelle and didn't let his height get in the way of his work, often taken to sitting on Lucille's cab side sheets, still able to work the controls. But don't think for a second of trying to outdrink him, for he was known to hold 4 times his own weight in beer. John knew this because his own grandfather, a platelayer who graced the same establishments, was left humiliated by Des on such occasions. Many a night would pass where Des was seen exchanging pleasantries in the bar at the Barnwell Crown, and then in high spirits on Lucille's footplate the next morning. Despite his fondness for a pint, Des Harold had a hand for Lucille's regulator so delicate it was gentlemanly. With Des at the controls, Lucille could handle anything you put behind her, even when she was getting overdue major overhaul. It was as though Des and his engine were inseparable. Until one day, after one of these late nights in autumn 1932, Des Harold didn't turn up for work. His wife, with whom he'd apparently disputed the night before, declared he hadn't come home, yet the barman saw him off before the day dawned. Nobody had seen him since. 4 miles of the local canal were dragged but revealed nothing. He had literally vanished without trace. Things weren't the same at Granwell's after that. John went on to describe a driver that had been brought in from the LMS, an ex-Midland man, thus was met with a hostile reception from ex-Northwestern and LNY associates. He only took the job following a dispute with his previous employer, and Granwell's were all who'd take him on. But he treated Lucille, who was long overdue boiler work by this point, like one of his underpowered Midland types, resorting to constantly sticking the regulator in the roof. She leaked and clanked so bad as though work became torturous, and she wanted putting out of her misery. She seemed to express this through a series of accidents, starting with a derailment following Lucille's brakes proving ineffective when bringing some empty wagons down to the pit. Her fireman was thrown clear and broke his neck on landing, while a bystanding mine worker was crushed by one of the wrecked wagons. Then a broken gauge glass and a melted fusible plug occurred in the same week. They were lucky not to lose the firebox crown. But things came to a head less than a month after Des's disappearance. When other collieries began striking, Granwell's remained a comparatively happy and lucrative affair. Until when moving the heap of ash from discarded locomotive fires one day, 2 men discovered Des Harold's diamond wedding ring buried deep in the pile. Rumour began to circulate that Des had been murdered, and the evidence burned as a cover-up. Arthur Granwell's son Frederick, who was in charge by this point and had been known for accepting bribes, denied such allegations. Indeed, when the inquest came up, 5 people all testified that he'd been away on business on the night that Des disappeared. Nor, according to John, did Des and Frederick have any rift in the loot, as it were. But that didn't stop mine workers from joining the Jarrow marches in protest of his response, nor did it stop word of a shadowy figure, similar to the height of Des, being seen hanging around the shed for weeks afterwards. The scandal led to Frederick being forced to resign, and although he remained the owner, his brother William hastily filled in as manager. Unfortunately, William was more business inclined than a sentimentalist, so when Lucille failed again after throwing one of the 4 rods, William lost patience. With 2 other engines handling the traffic, he ordered Lucille be oiled one last time, boarded up in her shed, and left there. That would explain why Lucille's records were blank after 1932. But John went on telling me that, in World War II, when all defunct machinery was pressed into service, an attempt was made to fire her up once more. The bolts on the shed doors were rusted so solid they had to be broken off with oxyacetylene. And when entry was finally made, her glasses refitted and her boiler filled, attempts to light her fire kept being stifled by a mysterious secondary draft overwhelming the flames. When the fire was lit, she just wouldn't make steam, even when she held a fire for 3 days, at the end of which both manager and crew grew impatient, and undertook a strange and highly dangerous tactic of gently warming the firebox from the outside by gently circling 2 oxyacetylene torches against it. This barely lasted a few minutes when the material around a washout plug at the back of the firebox failed, resulting in the rupture I was faced with repairing. The hot projectile launched at high velocity out into one of the men's stomachs, followed by the cab being infiltrated by a jet of hot water from the now ruptured box. Both men on the footplate were later lost to their injuries. In his haste, turning to head home in the fading light, William Granwell ordered Lucille be broken up by the following morning. This order was taken literally, with one of the workers left behind with his gas axe. Next morning, the worker in question was found slain in the shed. His body was covered in horrific scalds through to the bone, and his right arm dissected so crudely one might assume it had been burnt off. Stories range from a simple accident with his own oxyacetylene to a conspired murder and, with some imagination, a visit from the ghost of little Desmond Harold. But something must have gotten to William Granwell, for he knew the man he'd left to finish the job wasn't reckless with his equipment, so this couldn't have been an accident in his mind. He ordered Lucille be touched no further, but boarded back up and left. This explained the noted U-turn in her records, and perhaps her poor condition. But John finished his damning testimony that to this day, nobody knows what became of Desmond Harold. I pondered on John's stories through our first 2 trips on the engine. To be honest, given the nature of the public bar such stories had passed through down the years, it all seemed like he was winding me up, just like that passing mine worker at Granwell's. But my thoughts, along with our 3rd trip, were hastily cut short when the austerity began to lurch and clank in an ungodly fashion. We stopped halfway along the line, and upon examination we found one of the springs on the front axle broken. No further trains ran that day, and work on Lucille had to wait another week while it was replaced. A bigger railway, like the Bluebell, could turn this sort of work around in a day or so, but when you're working mostly on your own, it takes much longer. I couldn't return to work on Lucille until after my footplate turns that following weekend. The week beginning Monday the 15th of October marked a turning point in the restoration. My usual warm and idyllic morning welcome in summer now seemed gloomy. What with the grey overcast and yellowish tint on the trees, the honeymoon period of turning up for my so-called dream job had been replaced with a sense of dread. Until then I hadn't noticed how much dampness the trees held, and how foul the stench was. But Mr Granwell was paying me good money to do this job, so I pressed on. With the last of the tubes out and all sharp edges taken off both tube plates, I turned my attention to the firebox. Once the firebars were removed, I could climb up in the box from under the engine and carry out a thorough inspection. I wanted to check all the stays that separate both outer and inner wrappers of the box, so I began the laborious process of sitting inside the box and tapping the end of each one with a hammer. A bounce from the hammer with a loud chime meant the stay was fine, but no bounce and a muted thud meant the stay was a dud. To my annoyance, the top 4 rows of stays revealed several which had wasted beyond use. Removal took place over the following days. Each one needed drilling out and a new screw thread cut through the subsequent hole. This was followed by machining new stays on one of the lathes, each one needing the same size of screw thread cut at either end. I wanted all the stays fitted and ready to hammer over by the end of the week, so I decided to work late that Friday night. I had 2 more rows of stays left to fit by my usual clocking off time, when I felt the temperature inside the box drop, as a cold breeze began drawing itself through the firewall door. Its force became strong enough to dislodge my inspection light, crudely clipped onto the end of the fusible plug, which proceeded to fall to the ground beneath me and smash the bulb on impact. Mildly annoyed by the inconvenience, I went over to one of the storage cabinets to get a new bulb. Once it had been collected, I turned to head back to my work, when I swore I could see a flicker of light coming from Lucille's cab. It was only brief, and I shrugged it off as an optical illusion. A trick of the shed lighting, perhaps. But no sooner did I fix the new bulb in place and resume my work, another breeze drew through the firewall door. It wasn't as strong this time, but its presence was enough to distract my attention as I worked. I managed to screw another stay home before the wind got so prominent that I got fed up with it. It couldn't be possible without a clear tunnel through the entire boiler, let alone enough steam to work the blower. I climbed up to the smoke box to check the dustbin lid we fashioned for a chimney cab, wondering if it had been removed. It was still there, yet it sat halfway off and wasn't covering the chimney. That's weird, I thought, remembering that I was the one who put the cap on to begin with. Who moved it? I couldn't remember seeing anyone climb up to the chimney since. But I wasn't in the mood for problem searching, so I put the cap fully back on the chimney and returned to my work. Despite being cooped up in such a tight space, It wasn't warm inside the box, all material being freezing cold to the touch. The only warmth I could feel was coming from the transistor radio I had to fill the silence, music accompanying me as I slowly drove each stay home. I was 5 stays away from finishing on 10 o'clock when I caught whiff of something odd, the smell of melting plastic. I felt the radio and found it surprisingly hot to the touch. There was no sign of smoke, but checking the electrical connection at the back must have triggered something, for the radio went silent, and suddenly the lights in the whole workshop went out. I could barely see the space before me, the room so pitch black it was unbearable. It took about a minute before I could see the moonlight reflecting through the firewall door. My natural senses took some time to help me out from underneath the box, my eyes as wide open as I could make them to help my pupils adjust to the pitch black workshop. With some fumbling around, occasionally tripping on pallets and tools, I was able to find the shed fuse box and turn the mains power back on. My eyes winced at the returning brightness, but for some reason the music didn't come back. When I turned to go back to work, I saw more flickering coming from the cab. As I got closer, my assumption of it being an optical illusion was quickly crushed when I discovered the radio was on fire. Quick as I could, I unplugged the radio from the mains, grabbed the nearest fire extinguisher and doused the flames, all while trying not to breathe in the toxic fumes. When the fire was out, I looked at the radio and saw a palm print melted into the top. But what on earth could have caused it? I don't recall touching more than the power button, and the radio itself was last tuned many weeks prior. And what hand could possibly be so hot as to melt plastic in such a fashion? I proceeded to search the shed, calling out as I went, but heard no response. With a torch in hand, I searched the station outside, sensing some trespasser playing tricks. For the first time since coming to Yarley Pit, I felt unnerved walking around the site. A solitary floodlight stood over the station forecourt and shed, normally beaming enough to reassure you of your presence. But tonight, maybe due to what I'd just witnessed, the smell of dampness coming off the trees, or my own fatigue through work, it felt dimmer than usual. In my search, I found nobody, though a shock to my wits came in the form of distant screeching. It may only have been a local family of foxes, but I wouldn't blame you for thinking of innocent women being slaughtered. It was only when I looked back towards the shed that I swear I noticed a faint trickle of smoke coming from the shed vents, just like John Surtees had mentioned. I dashed back inside, anticipating another fire had burst out when I was searching, but again, there was nothing. As I'd been on site more than 16 hours by this point, I decided to cut my losses, unplug all electrics, put out whatever embers were left in the stove, and finish the last of the stairs early tomorrow morning. I didn't hang around to see if John's light and smoke reappeared, but I'd never been more grateful for my car starting first time before then. With help from Bill Tinwell that Saturday morning, we drove the final stays home and started hammering over the ends, exactly like you would hammer over hot rivets when joining frames together. It was a sweaty and loud process. Gloves and ear defenders only do so much to protect you. To make matters worse, by the end of the day we were just over halfway through the job before Bill had to head for home, and he told me that he couldn't come back in to help for another week. I was relieved at the excuse to clock off before darkness fell, but I grew frustrated. Whatever lead we'd gained over the summer was being lost over the stays and our operating fleet. A visit from Mr Granwell during Bill's absence angered me further. He blamed me for not seeking replacement help to finish the work quicker, even though I was asking all available hands. Volunteers are scarce during the week, especially in winter, but he didn't see it that way. Between Bill and I, our collective attitude towards the old man had worn thin. His public image may have been powerful enough to paint him favourably, but his frivolous orders had ruined his image in our eyes. With all these events mounting up, I couldn't help thinking that, with her unfortunate past and my own unnerving experience with the power cut, something in my mind was starting to tell me that maybe John Surtees was right after all. But I was in no financial position to leave the project now. I wanted to confide all my newfound knowledge of the engine with Bill, who I shared many happy drinking sessions with since our Worth Valley days, but I knew deep down that it would do no good. For Bill wasn't a man to call a spade so much as an effing shovel. So you can imagine how supernatural tales would be met. Eventually we reached the 1st of December. Like so many railways by this point, Yarley Pit ran its own Santa special season. Each station lit up with Christmas decorations and lights, both austerities running a 2-train service with additional volunteers dressed as Father Christmas and his elves on board. We'd run them since we started 3 years before, and despite the cold weather, it was always our most lucrative and enjoyable time of the year. But work on Lucille had worn me down to the point of apathy. I smiled for our many happy passengers as I drove the first trip of the day, but I confess it was a mask. To make matters worse, as we returned to the main station, we saw on the platform that Mr Granwell had turned up for his monthly visit. He seemed to have deteriorated since I saw him last, for he now walked with a cane at a slower pace than before, and he wore a hat, presumably to hide a now receding hairline to match his whiskers, turning light grey. As he approached me, something about his demeanour filled my heart with dread, as I anticipated his next impetuous decision in Lucille's restoration.
I've asked the boiler inspector to do the hydraulic test on Wednesday. Think you'll be ready for it, Andy?
This was the last thing I wanted to hear. Not only had he booked a hydraulic test on the boiler without consulting me first, but the work on the stairs meant I was behind on fitting the tubes and mending the area around the plug hole, which I discovered thinner than the rest of the firebox. I was certain it would fail, if I could finish the work in time. Expecting an equally frivolous rebuttal, I told him the plug hole area was too thin and, in an ideal world, the whole back of the firebox would need cutting off and replacing. Sure enough, his answer was just what I expected.
Too thin? Damn it, Andrew, I've steamed boilers half the thickness. Just weld and rethread that plug hole and have done with it. Do I have to get someone else in to do your job?
Now, I like to think of myself as a patient man. I can take a joke, I can shoulder blame made in jest, and when someone's demanding too much from me, it doesn't break my stride. But this balance of power from outside my organisation was really trying my patience, and whatever fear I had of Mr Granwell's status had been overcome with blunt-mindedness. "Now look," I retorted, "you can run your traction engines however you see fit, but this is a public railway. If that boiler fails, we are liable for it. No inspector would pass her for 10 years if we don't do it properly, and you know it." But he wasn't having it.
I don't care how you do it, just get it ready for the test on Wednesday. I want that engine passed and running before Christmas Day, so you'd better pull your head out. I won't tell you again.
With his cane propping his step, the old man made haste to his car and sped off, leaving me smarting about his attitude for the rest of the day. I must confess at points throughout the day, much as it shouldn't, the thought of throttling the old man crossed my mind. I asked one of the other firemen to fill my Sunday turn on the footplate, while I spent my time working on a compromise. My plan was to cut the wasted area back to where the material was good, fabricate a patch from a pile of off-cut materials, weld it in place, then drill and cut a new plug hole thread through the middle of it. Now, to be fair to the old man, this solution would be quicker and cheaper than replacing the whole back end, and the work itself was by no means difficult. But the patchwork put me another day behind. How I finished expanding the tubes, blanked off all the gauges and filled the boiler with water by test day was down to cutting back on tea and lunch breaks. I made sure work finished each day well before 6 o'clock, so as to avoid any further unnerving experience. That Wednesday came round almost a great relief, as the boiler inspector arrived to view the hydraulic test. With the boiler full of water, compressed air was pumped into the remaining space until the pressure gauge read twice as high as normal. We both looked around each join, rivet, stay and plug, trying to identify any leaks. But to my surprise, especially since the backhead had only been patched up 2 days prior, none were found. To my relief, Lucille had passed her hydraulic test. I can come back for a full steam test on Saturday the 22nd if that works for you, inquired the inspector. Seeing as this met Mr Granwell's request to run the engine before Christmas Day, it was arranged. But while the end was in sight, I couldn't think of the old man without wanting rid of him before then. With the hydraulic out the way, work could press on. That weekend, while Bill and I worked on refitting the last of the gauges and plumbing, volunteers refitted the cab and boiler cladding before applying the first coats of paint. Nobody saw nor heard from Mr Granwell as we worked. Outstanding jobs over the final week were significantly less frantic. The fitting of a vacuum brake ejector and new cab floorboards were the biggest ones left, while volunteers who had annual leave spent the rest of the time painting. But as each day edged closer, I hesitated to work for long after dark. I was grateful not to have more work on the boiler, but something about Lucille was still putting me off returning her to steam on the 22nd. Normally, when someone pours their all into an overhaul, they just want it finished and out the way. But her history and my own personal experience were putting me in a bad way. To add insult to injury, the test day was also winter solstice, the shortest, darkest day of the year. And knowing how off-putting the sight at Yarley Pit had become in the dark, my existing dread kept me awake well into the night before. I hesitated until first daybreak before heading down to Yarley Pit that morning. While overcast, the rain held off as I drove into the yard and parked next to the shed. For a moment, I was briefly reminded of the power outage from 2 months ago, as smoke eerily trickled through the vents in the roof. You can imagine my relief when I saw Bill Tinwell tending to the fire, slowly bringing Lucille up to pressure. About half an hour later, Mr Granwell's familiar Black Panther cruised into the yard. But to our surprise, he didn't get out from the driver's side. What emerged from the passenger seat was a frail and considerably aged version of his former self. With his cane in hand, he stooped gingerly over to proceedings. He sat down on a nearby picnic bench, watching us tentatively bring Lucille back to life. But he said nothing. We pulled Lucille out from the workshop with one of the austerities before it had to collect the first train. Parked outside on the shed row opposite the platform, I must admit, despite all the worry she gave me, she looked immaculate. But I was determined that as soon as the job was over, Mr Granwell would take her elsewhere, for I wanted nothing more to do with her. The boiler inspector arrived at 10 a.m, just as the first train departed, and began looking round. He found no qualms in the smoke box nor the dome as he moved his way towards the cab. All the while, I couldn't help but gaze anxiously at that troublesome washout plug that I had to patch up. When he arrived at the plug that caused so many headaches, he just gave it a quick glance, didn't say anything, and moved on to the next one. I could hardly believe it. So much myth, tension and headache surrounding that one troublesome spot on the entire boiler, and the inspector seemed happy with it. It was enough to make you wonder if all the angst and worry were for nothing. He continued looking round, asking me questions on the work that we'd carried out, while Bill occasionally added more coal to the fire. And slowly, most suspenseful, the old-fashioned safety valves began to breathe steam as the boiler pressure crept towards the red line. Just as the service train arrived back at the station, the inspector, satisfied with what he saw, finally filled out the first paperwork for Lucille's boiler certificate in over half a century, and stood back in admiration. She was up to full pressure now, with myself and Mr Granwell standing next to her. A small crowd of volunteers and passengers joined the inspector on the platform, some with cameras pointing at us, waiting to see history in the making. We all witnessed it all right, but their distance and head-on angle, caused by the back of the passenger train limiting their view, meant those on the platform saw it very differently to me. "Want to take her, Squire?" I asked the old man. He smiled at me for the first time since we assessed her at Granwell's.
"Aye, this one's for Des."
He climbed up and was just about to wind the reversing handle into full forward when the most extraordinary and horrific thing happened. With a loud pop from the cab, a cloud of steam burst outwards from the new washout plug as if the boiler was about to explode. The cab was quickly engulfed, hiding Mr Granwell from all view. I braved the cloud to climb up and try to retrieve the old man, but as I mounted the steps, an almighty wail came from the old man as a blaze shot out from the firehole door, wrapping itself around its unfortunate prey. The cloud cleared a little bit to reveal the old man covered by claw-like flames gripping him through the firehole door. With his arms flailing like mad, I hooked myself under Mr Granwell's shoulders and pulled with all my strength, hoping to drag him clear of the footplate. But whether a loose bit of clothing hooked itself on the controls I couldn't determine, for the old man remained caught in place. Bill quickly jumped up and pulled all his weight against my own shoulders, with the old man crying out in sheer agony. But it was no use. What with the hot steam and the fire that had caught a hold of Mr Granwell, everything became too intense to bear. So we quickly retreated to a safe distance, hoping the old man would free himself, jump and roll. But he didn't. Instead, a further fireball shot through the door and overwhelmed the invading steam. I saw the blast knock a loose pot of cleaning paraffin off the fireman's shelf and onto the wooden cab floor, which immediately went up in flames. Bill and I were lucky to retreat to a safe distance with little worse than singed overalls. But when we looked back, we found an inferno the size of a small factory chimney had replaced the once graceful cab. Nobody could do anything but watch as both safety valves and whistle let out long, ear-piercing jets of steam high into the atmosphere. The noise was nothing that any human should hear. Word of the blaze must have gotten out quick, for 2 fire tenders were on the site within minutes, but old steam engineers would tell you that quenching any kind of hot metal with cold water cracks it beyond all use, and any further cracks in that boiler may risk it going up, so while the fire brigade kept the flames from spreading elsewhere, the rest of us could only stand and watch the flames engulf old Lucille. She stood there, screaming like a banshee. When the fire eventually died down, we examined what remained. The gleaming paintwork on Lucille's cab resembled the morning remains of a bonfire. We dug the smouldering embers out the firebox and found whatever left of Mr Granwell's body charred beyond recognition. The wrecked engine was in no fit state to move under her own power, so volunteers were left to damp her down while the police took Bill and I in for questioning. He never spoke a word. The subsequent inquiry was the talk of the nation for weeks. Old man Granwell was very popular, and his death very unorthodox after all. I told the officers and the jury everything I could, but I daren't say about Lucille's history, or the breeze, or the flickering, or how exactly Granwell met his demise. But Bill Tinwell, who I've known for years and was never afraid to speak his mind, remained silent, too far in shock to answer any questions. He was found dead in his cell after his first day in court. It was only through my own confinement that I pictured what I believe may have happened on the night that Lucille's old driver, Desmond Harold, had disappeared. To my mind, walking home from the pub as later suggested and still in the doghouse with his wife, I believe he may have taken to crawling into Lucille's empty firebox to keep warm. Inebriated as he was, he must have fallen into a sleep so deep that only the greatest shock to the skin could wake him. Barely hours later, the firelighter would have arrived to warm up Lucille for the day's work. I doubt any complacency would have noticed Des asleep in that firebox as they threw wood, rags and a match into the firehole door and closed it up before it was too late. So when Lucille's ashpan was finally cleaned out at the end of the day, all that would have remained was his diamond wedding ring. But we'll probably never know for sure, for there are still some who believed it was murder. But my theory might have explained something that bugged me as soon as the incident occurred. Those claw-like flames I mentioned? The more I relived the events over and over again in my mind, the more those flames resembled a scalded pair of arms, red and with open burns exposing putrid hot flesh. They seemed to grip the old man with intent that one likens to revenge. Whatever the history of the events, John Surtees failed to come forward. My own prejudice against the old man was brought against me. The prosecution claimed outrageously that we had willingly forced him through the fire-hole door. Despite my call for witnesses on the platform, the obstructing passenger train meant little could be seen beyond the front of the engine. When I mentioned the paraffin pot, murmurs around the court soon spread to thinking that Bill and I had purposefully doused the cab floor in the stuff, helping it to go up as it did. This would have been tumultuous enough, but the fact that his doctor also revealed that the man had been diagnosed with an aggressive tumour and had been given 12 to 18 months explained his rapid deterioration and his keenness to hurry the restoration along. Numbed as I was by this point, the temptation to blurt out the whole story to the court, starting with Lucille's demise at Granwell's, the fire-hole breeze and the flickering, the power outage and the radio, ending with my own supernatural experience on Lucille's footplate, was strong enough to drive one to madness. But as the only living defendant representing the railway, I knew that was all too fantastic for the prosecution to believe, and how intolerant word of mouth is. In the end, numbed and unable to explain myself, I folded. The court found me guilty of gross negligence manslaughter and sentenced me to life. So here I am, all these years on, still inside. I'm told with good behaviour I might be eligible for parole, but I doubt I would get it. No matter what really happened and what model prisoner I may have been, both jury and public seem to have made up their mind. Ask yourself, who would wish a man with those sorts of convictions on the outside? Is anyone truly forgiven after doing time? How many believe in truth that doesn't match theirs? And what's stronger anyway, facts or narratives? Anyway, I've advanced too far in years to make a fresh start. I've often wondered why old man Granwell ended up in the fire instead of Bill or me, but seeing as a Granwell was in charge when Des went missing, maybe fate had some choice in making these things happen. I'll leave it for you to decide if all this is true or not, for I've told you all I can, and obviously you'll believe what you wish. As for Lucille, well, despite what happened, she did run again. I read in a second-hand railway magazine that old man Granwell's son inherited her, along with the rest of his collection. His fortune financed a further rebuild, which included, so I've read, a brand new boiler. Once rebuilt, no major issues have come about, so I'm told. Practically as good as her first day's service. It's my reckoning that once the inner firebox was gone, whatever curse she carried must have lifted. But having said that, there are some who refuse to do a turn on her. I can't say I blame them. I was never one for superstition in me youth, but I'd sooner spend the rest of my life as an internal scapegoat than lay any further sight or sense on that infernal machine. Hey everybody, if you're listening to this still, then thanks for tuning in and thanks for sticking with it. I don't usually do ghost stories, and writing something like this is way out of my comfort zone. But when I got writer's block one day, I started doing this as a sort of warm-up exercise, and eventually I just got carried away writing something in the style of Tom Rolt's Sleep No More stories. So if you enjoyed it, then I'm glad you did. If you didn't, then I'm sorry you didn't. And if you thought my northern accent sounded like Dick Van Dyke pulling off a really bad English accent, then I can only apologise. But seeing as this story was set in the north of England, it wouldn't have made any sense having a southern accent. A bit like having a Texan character voiced by a Canadian actor, it just would have sounded really jarring. Anyway, rambling aside, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I'd like to thank all my YouTube members and my patrons and all my regular viewers for tuning in and supporting my channel even during times of low output. I'd also like to give a thank you to Dean Walker for supplying the thumbnails and the artwork, and a shout out as well to Reese, Dave, Dean, Ryan, Doug and Train of Thought for their input on the story. Not to mention a thanks for the latter for voicing Mr Granwell. Anyway, normal service on the channel can resume now. Meanwhile, thanks for tuning in, and don't ever stop being awesome.